to be talking about CQIs. So this is a new topic for us as Plexus in terms of us talking about them. They're old hat in terms of they've been around a while. We certainly implement them. But at the same time, this is a brand new kind of subject, let's say, in our webinar series. So we're really excited to be able to do a webinar on this. This has been a want for a while. What I'd like to do here, consistent with any of the other webinars that you may have taken from Plexus, I want to go ahead and I want to kind of start with the agenda. So from my side, we're going to go through and we're really going to divide this into 4 main milestones for the hour that we're spending together. The first thing that we're going to do, we're going to talk about what CQIs are, because one of the things we find as we go out into the field is there's a general, let's say, agreement that it's some form of an assessment. However, the intent of the assessment, how to perform the assessment, and where it fits in the overarching structure, we get a lot of variation from the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get you comfortable with what the CQIs are so that you've got a very good baseline going forward. Then we're going to talk a little bit about CQI and IATF linkage. From there, now that you understand what the CQIs are attempting to do, where they fit within the larger structure of the scheme, we're going to show you some of the best things that we've come up with as consultants and auditors for CQIs in creating a CQI plan that will actually work in your facility. So we're going to be sharing some horror stories from the field, but we're also going to be sharing some very real best practices. So I think that toward the end of this, you get a lot of good actionable things. Now, notice I said actionable, simple things, but not necessarily easy things. Implementation is always an uphill battle against culture. So while we will be showing you best practices, you're going to have to go back and your success will be directly dependent on how effectively you deploy them. And one of the most exciting things for at least me as somebody who enjoys the open discussion is the open Q&A. After we've gone through our spiel, you're going to get 15 minutes or so with the experts on CQIs to ask your implementation questions, any questions you may have around CQIs. So that's going to be a good 15 minutes. That'll be a little bit toward the end. We've got a couple different presenters here today. So for those of you that have taken webinars with me before, I'm kind of a fixture here. My name is Jeremy Hazel, and I'll be kind of moderating it, walking through it, getting you from one topic to the other. But we have Carlene here, who is a guest presenter and works for Plexus as well. So Carlene, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let you introduce yourself here and tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My background is 45 years experience in manufacturing, specializing in core tools. I am certified as a lead auditor for the ISO standards, 9001, 14001, 45001, and including 13485 medical devices and IATF 16949. I perform gap analysis, training, internal audits. I'm also certified in all the CQIs, which are the special process CQIs and the process CQIs. And welcome and thank you for attending.
All right, gang. And anybody that's been on the webinar with me knows a little bit about me. I work for Plexus International there, been on pretty much every webinar we've ever done. So let's go ahead and get started here in terms of setting the stage. With that, Carlene, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you as you are our resident expert. And so if you just want me to slide jockey for you, I will be more than happy to turn the slides you need. Why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Okay, let's start with setting the stage of what is a CQI. So a CQI is continuous quality improvement known as a CQI. This is to be considered as part of performance management. It also is long-term and should definitely drive continual improvement, just like your IATF standards or your ISO standards. This offers teams the opportunity to test and implement. And when we say implement, that's not an easy thing. This is not a desk audit. It should show improvement over time, over the cycles, the annual assessments that you perform. It also is used for performance management to encourage team members, not just the team members, but you definitely, just like all the standards, need the support from top management. If you do not have the support from top management, you're going to have a very difficult time implementing the CQIs within your system and showing continual improvement. Okay, Jeremy, next slide.
All right. Before we go to the next slide, folks, I do want to connect on a couple different things here. When we look at CQIs, as we begin kind of working through how to communicate what a CQI is, I think that it's relevant to everybody on this call that a CQI could be looked at as a collection of best practices around highly complex processes. Some of those processes are manufacturing, like molding, heat treating, plating. Some of those processes are things like effective problem solving, right? And I think we largely agree that effective problem solving, while a universal thing, is not the easiest thing necessarily to do. So the CQI standards, folks, are a collection of best practices around highly complex processes. And what you gain from these is you gained the collective knowledge of the 40, 50, 60 years that have come before in these technologies so that you don't have to make the same mistakes that somebody else did. And so when we look at the continual quality improvement, CQI, these processes and the manuals that you would get from AIAG when they write these processes allow you to not make the same mistakes as others. So for me, we might look at them as a standard. And this is what Carlene was mentioning. They are a tool, right? They are an assessment. But at the same time, I want you to think of what's entitled or what's contained in that assessment as the best practice knowledge for the last, say, 50 years plus of things that go on inside of those highly complex processes. All right, let's go ahead and take a look, Carlene. We'll talk about processes that have to be audited when conducting the CQI.
Okay, you need to keep in mind, especially if you're IATF certified, you have to think of linkages. The CQI itself is an assessment. However, you also need to link in the other processes within your organization. That means a maintenance process, PMs, calibration, document record control, training and competency, obviously your manufacturing processes. And keep in mind the CQI assessment, these are minimum requirements. You need to look at your CSRs, your customer specific requirements. They may state something over and above the CQI minimum requirements. Receiving and process final inspection is a process. CQI should start with the RFQ process and go through the quoting process. A lot of organizations are very weak in this area. They don't know or understand the CQI requirements. They submit the quote, they receive the program or the launch of a new program or an existing like program, and they don't realize until start a production that this is going to cost them more money. So a lot of organizations are very weak in the RFQ and quoting, not just looking at the CSR requirements, but also the CQI requirements. Purchasing is one of the big links that link into the CQIs. Management review. Management review. One of the inputs from IATF is that your assessments, your audits are to be reviewed by top management. So when these management review meetings are held, these CQI assessments are required to be reviewed by your top management. And the IATF standards, ISO standards, top management is responsible for these assessments. They own it and the internal audits. Corrective action, problem solving. If you see year after year when conducting these CQIs, you have the same nonconformances. What is that telling you? It's telling you that you have an effective corrective action and problem solving process in place. Audit management is one of the linkages. One thing I recommend when you conduct these CQIs annually, do it at the same time that you're conducting your IATF or ISO internal audits, because you will be looking at all these linkages between the processes. So why not do it at the same time? You're already looking at records and procedures and work instructions. There's no reason to go out twice and interview these process owners. It can be done in parallel at the same time. Okay,
Okay.
Jeremy.
All right. I'll change slides here in just a second. Now, I'm going to kind of paraphrase and I'm going to add on to what she's talking about here, folks. This is one of the most misunderstood areas when we go into organizations that do these assessments. Let's say, and I'm just going to pick on one process. Let's say that you have heat treating, right? We'll put a little HT right here. Okay, this is a heat treating process. Now there's a CQI for this, right? And we mentioned the CQIs. The CQI is like a collection of best practices. Most people think when they go out to do a CQI assessment that they're only looking at the heat treating process. But what Carlene is mentioning here, when you do these assessments, it is a requirement, we'll talk about this later, that you audit from a process-based perspective. And when you look at these assessments, right, most of the assessments for the technical processes are grouped the same way. There's an overall system assessment with a series of technology dependent worksheets, right? Individual things that have to be filled out based on technology. And when you do the assessment, it will require you to go into processes like maintenance, calibration, document and record control, 100% training and competency. And so if you start looking at it in this way, does this look an awful lot like a process-based audit from an IATF style perspective? Absolutely. And what Carlene mentioned, if you are going out and auditing your processes and your systems, you can use that audit in conjunction with some of the specifics for this assessment to gain an efficiency. So many companies that we deal with, what we see them doing is they find their technical expert on heat treat, they hand over the assessment sheet and they go, please fill this out. And that technical expert in that technology probably is woefully underprepared to do everything else that comes with it. So the first thing we wanted you to see is what CQIs are trying to do. They're trying to communicate best practices for highly technologically complex processes to allow you the best shot of having a firm base. The second thing that it's trying to do, it's trying to show the interconnectedness of the system and its impact onto those special processes. So there has to be connection present. All right, Carlene, take it away.
Okay, the CQI assessment is required to be performed annually. However, look at your CSRs. It may state otherwise. It may require you to do it more frequently. These are to be reviewed by top management after you complete the assessment. Per IATF, management review meetings are required to be performed minimum annually. Don't wait for the management review meeting. As soon as these assessments are complete, you need to review these with your top management. Depending upon where the weaknesses are, it may require funds, okay, to add more equipment, maybe add more people. So it's very critical that you do review these assessments with your top management. There's
Okay.
numerous documents, records, procedures, and processes, okay, that are the same. So again, why not combine the two and save yourself time, like I mentioned in the previous slide? Because the CQIs do require the process approach, just like IATF and all the ISO standards. Okay,
Okay.
Jeremy?
Now, one thing that I'll mention, folks, on this one, because this slide struck a chord with me. Let's continue our heat treating example in the CQIs. And Carlene is absolutely right. There are things like a certain number of allowed reuses for things like thermocouples. And so coming into this assessment, let's say you do the assessment in November, right? But your management review and some of this review around the assessment doesn't come up until much later. If you have a certain amount of thermocouple reuse that's allowed, if you have to rebuy those, that could lead to a substantial cost in that process. Coming back to what Carlene was talking about, where your RFQ process needs to consider the CQIs, some of the things in the assessments, some of the tables, and some of the requirements will make changes to your spare parts inventory. They'll make changes to the frequencies of calibration. And so these sorts of things will require somebody with authority to move the checkbook, let's say, to know about them and to authorize the expenditure. So when we do this part, the quality of management review and the timeliness is going to be critical, let's say, to the success of the assessment. So don't lose sight of the RFQ process with CQIs. And certainly when you find gaps, don't wait to close the gaps because it may require financial investment above and beyond what your facility is currently willing to provide. Carlene, back to you.
So when we talk about the CQIs, there's two different groups of CQIs. There's special manufacturing processes, such as heat treat, plating, coating, welding, soldering, molding, brazing. One of the biggest weaknesses that I see when conducting these assessments, the on-site expert is not meeting the minimum 5-year requirement with either 5 years minimum experience and or education that would total the minimum 5 years. I've done a lot of virtual training on all these special processes. And it's amazing how many individuals will speak up and say, oh my gosh, we don't meet this minimum 5-year requirement. Well, if that's the case within your organization, if you don't have somebody meeting this minimum requirement, you can reach out to like Plexus. We can come in and do these assessments for you. I've also shadowed individuals, gotten them to the point of the minimum 5-year experience. Jeremy?
Okay. Now, along the technical side, I'm going to talk to the technical side for a minute because I do want to split the deck between the technical side and the process side. These CQI assessments, and Carlene is spot on, and I want everybody to kind of understand what you just said there. If you look at internal auditing as an aggregate, there's no universal minimum competency educational requirement or anything, right? It really is on a facility by facility, case by case basis. But in the CQI publications, it does call out a minimum of 5 years, as she put it, experience, education, combination thereof, right? So this is a big deal for those of you that are taking, say, training. We see a lot of people that go to the training who are competent auditors. But then when it comes to the technical aspects of their technology, say heat treating, they lack the 5-year knowledge. So they'll go back and they'll have to lean on those experts, or they'll send their expert who is super smart at, say, heat treating, but lacks an awareness and a knowledge of a process approach. So the CQIs really require a hybrid, let's say, of technical knowledge and auditing knowledge, which largely in other areas for auditors and assessors is not necessarily the same. So that is a big deal that we see. And this is one of those areas, I'll do a completely separate video one day on the value of done for you services. This may be one of those you look at and say, is it worth it to develop the in-house competencies? Or is this one that we should probably outsource to do the assessment? In this case, that is a much better discussion than it is, say, for internal auditing. All right, Carlene.
Okay, and then we have 8 process CQIs, which cover LPAs. When we think about LPAs, these are process audits. And if you're IATF certified, okay, there is a requirement to be a process auditor. You need to look at those requirements. These LPA auditors must know and understand the manufacturing process. They're required to understand risk assessment, understanding the PFEMAs, the control plans. There's warranty, air proofing. And when we talk about air proofing, okay, pokey oaks. Another big weakness that I see within the industry is that these pokey oaks are not identified in the PFEMAs and the control plans. Supplier management process, effective problem solving, cost to poor quality, design review, traceability. And when we are looking at these process CQIs, these should sound very familiar to you, because if you look at your process map of your organization for IATF, I would expect to see audit management, error proofing, supplier management, effective problem solving, cost to poor quality. So this is also now linking and pulling you into the IATF. For CQIs, like Jeremy mentioned, not only do you have a technical expert, but there should also be individuals on your team who have completed internal auditor training or lead auditor training and work on these assessments as a team. And keep in mind, you need to know and understand every single CSR, because your customer specific requirements will clearly state what CQIs they require for you to conduct annually. Also, you are required, if you outsource any of the processes, special processes mentioned on the previous slide, your suppliers are required to submit these to you annually. So you need to know and understand these requirements for when you review these. And you'd be surprised how many suppliers, year after year after year, all they do is change the date on it. It's very crucial that you compare from year to year, that this is driving continual improvement, and it is driving it is value added within not your supplier's organization, but yours. Jeremy?
Okay. On this note here, folks, I just want to take a minute here and I want to pause for the calls on a second on these. When we look at automotive manufacturing, right? This list of process-based CQIs is like a who's who of complex pain points that universally everybody has. When I go down this list, can we largely agree that warranty management is one of the most convoluted places in which we struggle? It's kind of like a dark corner where you just keep throwing money into, right? So they've created the CQI to help with that process in order to kind of flesh it out and try to get everybody best practices so that we could all have the same conversation. The same thing is true with sub-supplier management. And as a trainer here, effective problem solving. I would say on this list, that is the number one thing that organizations struggle with. Now, if you're a designer, can we largely agree that the design reviews can be fairly complex? Hundreds and hundreds of graphs, different prints. There is a CQI around design review that helps you go, what are the best practices? So that maybe I can gain some efficiency and improve the effectiveness around some of these processes. So if I'm working with an organization and they do these types of things, one of the first thing I'd recommend, get yourself a copy of the assessments, because at this point, you're going to get the best practices from everybody that came before you. I don't know about you, but I'd rather make a new mistake every day than make a mistake somebody else has made. All right, along that note, I think that it's time for a poll. So we do 2 polls here in every webinar. And the first poll is always about kind of getting us familiar as trainers, Carlene and I as presenters, who's in the room. Because if we have a lot of people that they CQI 23, we might talk a little bit more about molding as an example, right? If we have some people that are CQI 15 for welding, we might talk a little bit more about welding. So let's go ahead. And now it's time for you guys to help us on this one. I'm going to come through here and let's find the poll here. Right there, launch it out. All right. See it here? First question. Select the CQIs that apply to you or your organization. The reason we want to know this as trainers, as webinar hosts, we want to be able to give you some examples that are relevant to you. So if you do CQI 15 and a fair majority do CQI 15, we might talk a little bit about that when we talk about some examples. We want to add value to you. The second one, we're looking for your understanding of current CQI implementation. And the reason we want this, so far, Carlene and I have been operating under the assumption we're starting from square one. But if we have a higher level of awareness, we can switch some of the detail that we go into in some of the later slides to adjust for your level of knowledge. And lastly, we're interested in knowing where your understanding of CQIs come from. And the reason why we want to know this, many people in this space are self-taught. And when you are self-taught, it's good and bad. Good because you might learn a little quicker on examples that are yours. Bad because you might pick up some bad habits and some assumptions that may not be true. So this kind of gives us an example of how much, say, assumptions we have to dispel in order to get you something valuable. Now, we have a rule, 70% gets the job done. So we are currently at 61%. If you want the fun to stop, participate. Once we hit 70%, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and then I'll share with you guys how the group is doing. All right, 66% coming up with it, getting close. And we are over 70. Perfect. All right, let's go ahead and end this one. And one of the things we like to do with you, I go ahead and I share the results with you. Now, we've got a fair mix here. So Carlene, as we're going through the rest of it, we've got a fair mix of heat treaters, platers, coders, welders. So we got kind of a mixed bag. So we can use some examples from a little bit of everything. On this one, we got a lot of beginners, a few intermediate folks. So there's a little bit of experience back there, but we're definitely not quite at that advanced level yet. And lastly, most of them are coming from what was given into the document with a little bit of internal training. So that gives you a little bit of awareness on who's on the webinar at this point, so that we can talk a little bit about maybe some assumptions, things you thought that you may know that maybe we can dispel. So this is good stuff. This is going to help us a lot in the second half. All right, let's go ahead and stop sharing here. And let's go ahead and keep the ball rolling. We're now going into the second area of setting the stage. Carlene, why don't you tell us a little bit about the relationship between IETF and CQIs? Oh, muted.
Sorry about that. When we look at IATF, which clearly states that the process approach is a requirement. And when we look at IATF in the center, okay, the linkages into IATF, we talk about APQP, that's a process. We look at FEMA's, design, process FEMA's, MSA links into IATF, SPC, PPAP, CSRs, which dictate what CQIs are required for you to conduct for the annual assessment. That's why it's so crucial that you know and you understand what these CSRs are, because your CSRs address the process. Many organizations get confused between a customer specific requirement, which is a process requirement, and a customer requirement, which is a product or design requirement. They are entirely two different things. So again, you need to look at those CSRs. And when we look at the roadmap, okay, you want to describe your approach. Now, this should have already been predetermined during the IATF and ISO stages. You want to summarize past efforts, lessons learned. What's the best tool for this? Your FEMA's. Your FEMA is the best tool to look at for lessons learned. which number 4 is the lessons learned criteria. You want to assess your capacity. Again, assessing your capacity. That's going to link in with your RFQ, your quoting, your APQP process. So the CQI is your organization's roadmap for improving services, processes, capacity, obviously the outcome. It will allow you to describe your approach to the CQI. Again, CQIs require the process approach, just like the IATF and the ISO standards. Jeremy?
All right. So one thing that I wanted to cover on this one, and this is very near and dear to my heart because anybody that's been on a webinar knows I'm a terribly lazy guy. And so when you're looking at CQI implementation, the amount of strategy that you put in is going to play out as you begin to implement. And right here, describing your approach is a strategic decision. How do you get the most bang for your buck between system audits, process audits, product audits, and now these CQI assessments? And I really think that organizations, as we go through, Carlene mentioned the term pencil whipping stuff, right? From the supply base. Organizations do not do a good job of assessing their capacity in order to fulfill these. These things, as she said, it's an integrated process approach audit, and they can be very, very lengthy. And so if I had one box that I would focus on in terms of what would change my world, the ability to assess your capacity to perform these audits needs to be the thing that is most heavily weighed in terms of CQI implementation, because that is where most people fall down. Much like individuals, organizations generally think that they are better than they are, and then they fall a little bit short. People do the same thing. And so when we see assessments that aren't paying their way, it's largely because what they thought they were capable of in terms of time and resource doesn't actually play out. All right, Carlene, back to you.
So again, as stated numerous times, I can't express this enough. The process approach is a requirement. And when you look at the IATF standard in clause 4.3.2, it clearly states customer specific requirements. The IATF standard itself will not dictate to you what CQIs are required for your organization. They will be spelled out within your CSR. So the IATF standard is pulling in the CQIs by pulling in the CSRs. And those of you that are familiar with IATF, at least a dozen times when you read through that standard, CSRs come up. So the IATF standard has really driven and raised the bar on these CSRs. And these CSRs typically are more stringent than the IATF and ISO standards themselves, or maybe even the CSR assessment requirements. Jeremy?
All right. On this one, folks, I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. The only reason I really push to keep this in the webinar here, there is a tremendous amount of misinformation around what the IETF requires, and the CQIs are definitely in the realm of CSRs. So realize the cost, realize the CSR, and while we may give some general requirements around what's in those publications, your customer specific requirements will have a huge impact on the details surrounding it. And this is one of the things that I definitely wanted to communicate, because a lot of you that are on this call may be at that beginner level as present from the poll. The first thing to do, get yourself a copy of the assessment, figure out what it's asking you to do, and then assess your capabilities to do it. And from there, worry about the mechanics of it. So many people worry about the mechanics of how to do the assessment, but the strategy is flawed. The capacity to do it is flawed. Even the technical aptitude to do it is flawed. So you have to start from a strategic side down to a capacity side And what we're going to cover next here is some of the mechanical side on how to actually do it. So Carlene, I'm going to go ahead and bring it over to you now.
Okay, so let's talk about a CQI plan. Okay, there are some general components that you need to implement, review when trying to implement CQIs within your system. Obviously, you need a description of your organization and its systems. CQIs are applicable to all organizations where your customer specific requirements dictate this. It doesn't matter the size of your organization, the complexity of your organization. CQIs are a requirement for automotive. But with that being said, there are a lot of organizations that are not automotive and they're only ISO 9001 certified. That doesn't mean that they can't incorporate CQIs. What it means is that if you are automotive and you are IATF and your CSRs require CQIs, then you're required to implement this. This should give you a clear guide, a mission for the CQI work. You need to develop a team. You need to ensure that individuals on the team meet the minimum requirement. They're qualified, not only trained, but they are competent. Training is not good enough. You can train individuals sometimes 6, 7, 8 times, but they still don't get it. It doesn't mean that they're competent. CQIs, just like any other standard, you need to set goals. You need to measure it. Are you improving? Okay. Let the data tell you this. Facts and data should drive and show you immediately if there are improvements being made. A CQI is a method, it's a tool for you to use to drive these special processes and the CQI processes. It measures data, okay? Who's going to collect the data? Who's going to analyze the data? Who's going to track it? Who's going to assess it? It's not a means of just collecting a bunch of data and say, well, we have the data, we're good to go. No, that data needs to be reviewed. It needs to be analyzed. And this is going to show you immediately if continual improvement is being driven through these CQI assessments. This is a process for monitoring the CQI plans. So year after year, when you conduct these assessments, the first thing you should do is pull the previous year's assessment. Okay. If you see the same weaknesses, the same nonconformances, that's telling you that you're stagnant. There's no continual improvement happening. You need to ensure that your lead assessors not are only trained, but they're competent and qualified to conduct the assessment along with the team, just like we mentioned earlier. You should also have an individual on your team that has completed internal or lead auditor training. Jeremy?
On this one, I wanted to highlight this to make sure that I didn't lose sight of this. Folks, the CQI, as you mentioned, are a tool, but here's the way it works. If you are performing the assessments in a meaningful way, performance should improve. So the point here is, if we're going to spend money doing these assessments, because make no mistake, it does cost money, what are we going to get from it? And how do we know that the money that we spent is well worth it? So the goal is not to do the assessment every year. The goal is to use the CQIs to reduce PPM and also to improve process efficiency. So Carlene, coming back to your point there, you made a really good point here. When you look at measures and data collection and the assessment of progress, when you get this year's assessment, let's say, and I personally would never advocate doing it for only once a year. When you do the current assessment, let's say, you should be going back to the past assessment, looking at the performance of that process during that past assessment, and determining between the past assessment and the current, what are the things that are eating the organization's lunch, right? What are the pain points that they have? I'll give you an example. If I'm doing an assessment and I look at the current state versus the past state was good, but I've got an uptick, let's say, of corrective actions relating to, let's say, variation in the uniformity of my heat treat area. Maybe I have to look more closely then at that temperature uniformity survey. And when I think about sampling, if you have risk and a high degree of, say, scrap in an area, your sampling process for that job audit, whatever you want to call it, process table, whatever it may be, needs to be thought of. Because here's the way that I look at it. Manufacturing is similar to a bag of potato chips, right? Which potato chips go on the bag, right? The fully formed ones looking real good. But inside the bag, there's broken ones, there's crinkled ones, there's less than perfect ones. And so if you see a lot of scrap, that is a sure sign that there is something that is unstable inside of that process. And choosing one sample on a Tuesday is nowhere near indicative of how the process is actually performing. So when you do your CQIs, you mentioned the CQI plan, you want to use the same level of risk-based thinking, let's say preparedness, as you would for other areas of the IETF standard. All right, let's go ahead, Carlene, back to you.
So some critical areas that you should consider. Again, the lead assessor, okay? They are not meeting the minimum 5-year experience and or education, okay? That's a showstopper. You need to start with this. You need to ensure they meet this minimum requirement. It's a lead assessor's responsibility to ensure team members are trained and competent. So your lead assessor, okay, who has an area of expertise in that area, that technical area, it's their responsibility to form the team, ensure they're trained, and ensure they're competent. Maintenance plays a huge role in all these special processes. I am amazed when I do all the virtual training. It's typically all quality people, okay? People within your, especially your maintenance, engineering processes. They need to be part of this. I also see this during IATF and ISO training. It's always quality, okay? IATF is the process approach of numerous process owners. But for the CQI special processes, when we talk about thermocouples, inventory, replacement, reuse, calibration, system accuracy tests, furnace loading, okay? This is within the preventive predicted maintenance process. The process owner of the TPM owns this, not quality, okay? Jeremy?
Now, I do have one thing on this one, folks, and this is a thing as a professional trainer. I feel very strongly about this. When we look out into the world of CQI trainings, there are trainings out there that will tell you how to fill out the assessment form, right? The Excel that comes with the purchase of the CQI manuals. However, be wary of any training that tells you how to fill out the form. Because as Carlene just mentioned, figuring out what value to put in what box provides very little value in terms of the interconnectedness of the training. What Carlene has told you, and this is why we really talked about calling it implementing CQIs within your system, you have to look at the interconnectedness of things. So to look only at the process, only in the realm of the Excel, without looking at the process approach and the interconnectivity to maintenance, calibration, quotation. If the training doesn't form the holistic nature of everything that's required, you're only getting half the picture. So that is a huge thing we see in CQIs. And Carlene, why don't we go ahead and wrap it up here with common CQI weaknesses that you see in the field as cautionary tales?
Okay, some of the main weaknesses I see when performing these. The control plans do not align with the CQI minimum requirement of lot sizes and frequencies of inspection. Process parameters of the equipment are not identified within the control plans. The type of controls and monitoring frequencies, again, do not align with the
Oh, you hit mute accidentally.
okay. Critical to quality characteristics. The assessment calls these out, but they don't align with the control plans. The calibration frequencies, okay, do not align with the CQI requirements. Material handling job audits are not performed. There's no rework process or instruction or reinspection when rework or repair is performed. Pokeokes, airproofing are not identified in FEMA's control plans. And again, the process approach is either not understood or utilized. Jeremy?
I think that'll do it. I mean, I'm looking at what we're looking at here, and those 9, I believe, if I can count right today, those 9 are very common to what I see, as I've done a ton of CQI assessments in my time. So there's nothing much more I can add. I think that at this point, it's one of those things that we need to use the process approach, Carlene. Is that what I'm hearing is one of the requirements? And is that one of your top tips for a successful CQI assessment?
Absolutely.
Okay. So at that point, we talked a little bit about who can complete the assessment, but I want to cover with the last couple slides, how do we complete the assessment? Now, you've alluded to some of these before, right? That it is not a desk audit. Can you walk us through not just who, but how can we complete the assessment, and what have you seen in terms of the last assessments you've done?
Okay, when looking at this, okay, there's no verification or follow-up from corrective actions. Again, prior to performing the current assessment, look at the previous corrective actions. Have they been verified? Are they reoccurring? Root cause is not properly identified. This is critical. If you do not identify the system nonconformance and you're addressing the symptom only, trust me, it will reoccur. May take a little bit of time, but it will reoccur. Assessments are being pencil whipped. Okay, these are not desk audits. Individuals performing the assessments are not qualified. There's no support or interaction with top management, and also the linkage of process owners within your organization.
All right.
Jeremy?
So breaking it down here, if we go one step further, 7 steps into quality improvement using CQIs. What do you got as a closing remarks here for our folks before we go ahead and take on some Q&A?
Okay, the people, are they qualified? Problems, okay, are they understanding, identifying the causes? Step 3, aim. What are you trying to accomplish here? Okay, the intent isn't just do these annually because your CSR requires it. We filled it out, we're good to go, we submit it, we're done. That's not the intent of the CQI. Step 4, measuring the benefit to drive continual improvement. Should be changing ideas, and keep in mind, just like IATF, CQIs, it's a culture change. This will not happen overnight. Testing of the change, rapid learning cycles to test your change ideas. Spreading it, who or what may be facing similar problems, not just within, say, heat treat or molding, okay, but within your entire organization. Jeremy?
Okay, so what I wanted to do, and one of the reasons why we wanted to include this slide, folks, this is very similar to every plan, do, check, act type of thing that you may have heard from time and forever. But there was a couple points in here that I think differentiate it from what you may traditionally hear. The result of the CQI assessments should result in some way in a change of ideas, in a paradigm shift of how you think. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be easy, right? It's simple, but not easy. And one of my favorite things that comes from the software world, right, is one of those fail forward fast ideas. Test the change, rapid learning cycles. So when you do an assessment, if you decide to make a change as a result of a gap in an assessment, do not try to take that from the one instance, as she called it, the symptom, and then go organization wide right from the jump. Put the fix in place for the symptom, see if it works in curing that symptom in that instance. And if it proves out, then invest the time, resources, and funds to propagate and spread. So when we look at this, the thing that differentiates this from me from a traditional PDCA is step 5, 6, and 7. We know that we have to get the right people on the team. We know we have to identify, understand the problem. That's always been the case. But the rapid prototyping, the rapid testing, and a change in cultural mind shift means that it's not just going to be a flash in the pan for June 11th, but it's going to be a before and after moment for the organization. Before CQIs, after CQIs. That's what you strive for in improvement, right? So, all right, with that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to launch the second poll. And we're also going to bring our moderator back. Chris, why don't you go ahead and come on back here? And what we're going to do, we're going to launch the poll. All right, last poll, folks. Now, the reason why we're launching this poll, just so you know, we want to do more webinars for CQIs. We want to bring more value and we want to bring some more technical information to you. But we need you to tell us what you need, right? So the first question here, how much involvement do you have in your suppliers? Why do I ask that? Because if I find a lot of people on this call have multiple suppliers in organizations, I might do a webinar on sub-supplier CQI management because a lot of us are overseeing multiple suppliers. That's a reality. Secondly, the learning method that your organization takes to understand, this is going to help us figure out exactly how we can help you. And in third, this is one of those where if you want some help, do you want me to reach out to you? Right? That last one's a purely selfish question. So if you want to hear from me, hit me up. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and let this poll run, my friend. I will close this when I get to 70%. You want to take the reins and finish strong?
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Carlene. Yeah, as we submit your responses for that poll here, thank you. Yeah, one more slide. And please also feel free to submit your Q&A questions for our experts here. Now, if you're looking to gain access to any of the CQI standards, more training for your team, do visit aig.org or plexusintl.com to learn more. Obviously, with AIG membership, you can receive discounts on those standards as well as training and resources. Hopefully, you're actually on the AIG email list. I just saw a note today come out about CQI 11. We have a number of tutorial videos about that if you're looking for a refresher or to learn more about some of those best practices. So as we get going here, Jeremy, you can stop share. The first question I have is, maybe it's a tough one, maybe it's a hard one. Let's see. Do you know why the CSRs don't require all CQIs if the approach is continuous improvement?
Well, I'm going to say that there is no perfect answer for this. I'm going to give you my interpretation after having done this for a while. The CSRs are written by a certain number, let's say, of OEMs, let's say, and certain tier ones, tier twos, tier threes. And so I would say that, Chris, largely at the sub-tier level, a lot of organizations do not know that these things exist. So let's say that you're tier 4, right? And one of your tier 5 people does heat treating for you. At tier 4, they may not know that there is a CQI 9 that has a collection of best practices for a heat treat operation. Now, this is in direct dichotomy to where they are in this. As you go down the tier chain, the lower tiers have more requirements, but less staff. So the organizations that can benefit the most from having these best practices are largely the ones that are unaware that they exist. So Chris, I would say that when we see this, your OEMs are pretty good. Your tier 1s are pretty good. Where we're missing is when you get to the tiers 3s, 4s, 5s, they don't have that awareness that these may even be available. And if I was a tier 4 and I had a heat treater that was supplying, like, Joe's heat treating shack, you can bet I would give them a copy of the CQI assessment because it has calibration intervals, reuse intervals, and best practices that would keep Joe's heat treating shack from making the same mistakes that automotive has for the last 30 years. So that, in my opinion, is why. Carlene, do you have an opinion on that?
I think you pretty much covered it, Jeremy.
Okay. That's been my experience. They're largely unaware of what's in there. Yep.
Well, also too, some of the first and second tier suppliers don't realize that the CSRs dictate to them that they have to push that flow and the requirement down to the third and fourth tier. That's where I'm seeing a big weakness.
Awesome. All right, Chris, that gives us some guidance, bud.
Next one here. So obviously some great best practices from you folks. If we're looking to learn more or take this back to my team, what's the homework these individuals should take back to their organizations?
All right, I'll go first on this one. So if you're the one that got the information here from the webinar, right, and now it's going back to your organizations, step one, get a copy of the CQI because you'll get the assessment file and you'll get the book that kind of explains it. At that point, get a small dedicated team. And I'm talking small, I'm talking 1 or 2 people. Make sure, as Carlene mentioned, right, you have the right technical expertise, and go to one technology that you have on one part and try to do an assessment. This is huge. If you go in and you're learning the methodology and you're learning the process at the same time, and you're going to go all the way wall to wall, you will fail. So the first thing you're going to do, realize it exists, get the manual with the assessment, and fail forward fast. Work out all the kinks in your assessment in that area, and then take it to somebody who might be good at connecting the dots for integration and efficiency improvement. Because as Carlene mentioned, there is efficiency improvement possible. Most people think of it as system audit, process audit, product audit, CQI. No, the CQI can be done in conjunction if you strategize. Carlene, what are your pieces of advice?
Well, also what's crucial, okay, you receive the assessment, you order it, but before you attempt to do this on your own, ensure that you clearly understand the scoring guidelines, okay? If you're like me, I always scored more stringently, but make sure you know and understand the scoring guidelines because you may mislead your organization and your team thinking you're better than what you really are.
I think that is for everybody out there that's done FMEA. It's done an awful lot like the problems we had with RPN. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. We're getting them low RPNs and we think we're rock stars. Remember when I said organizations act like people? We always think we're better than we are.
Yep.
Fair enough. Chris, you want to do one more?
Yeah, let's do one more. Now, what is the recommended practice if an organization does not have an experienced lead assessor? Should we outsource?
Okay, I'm going to tell you straight up from my side. There are things that is worth my time and attention to work on, and I'm going to go totally contrary to what we teach in automotive. I'm going to channel my inner Gary V here. I stick with what I am good at and I triple down on my strengths. If I'm weak in some area, I have zero interest in trying to make that up. So for this type of assessment, if there is somebody that is technically savvy, I'm going to outsource that and I'm not going to look back one bit. Because if I don't have that capability, I really have to ask myself, with the time I would spend developing it, is that the best use of my time when I could be getting new business, making productivity improvements? And if the answer is no, know when to delegate. Carlene?
Well, you really don't have a choice in the matter, okay? If you don't have somebody meeting the minimum 5-year requirement, you can't do them in-house by yourself because you're going to submit this to the OEM, okay? And they should be asking who did this. Are they qualified? Have they met the requirement? And if they haven't, it's not a legitimate assessment. So your hands are kind of tied when it comes to that.
Fair enough, Chris.
Understood. I want to respect people's time, but I do want to take one more, if that's all right. Folks, thanks again for joining us. We'll take this last one now. CQIs require to implement corrective action in 90 days, but most of the really systematic improvements take more time. How do we overcome this contradiction?
All right. So this is a very common thing. So even in IETF, corrective actions, customers always want corrective action the shortest time possible, right? Because they see risk. So while it has to be done in 90 days, if it requires things like additional equipment, additional capital, or maybe a larger organizational push, my answer is the same in IETF as it is for CQI. Communicate bad news often, keep everybody informed, right? So they want CQIs in 90 days. I know that's what it says. You know what? In order to get this tooling fixed, whatever it is, or this furnace fixed, it's going to be 6 months. So people want 90 days. People always want 90 days. It doesn't change the answer. Even in IETF and just manufacturing in general, we always have it. But the communication first is key. What you can't do is go radio silent, show up on day 89 and say, oh, we're not going to be done for 6 months. What you should be looking at is how to mitigate the risk. And when we teach corrective action, when you put in a triage plan to prevent escapes, that's what you keep in place until you can pull the Band-Aid away. So I would do that. Carlene?
Well, but also look at your own internal procedures, okay? Maybe that timing is more stringent. Maybe your customers require that to be done within 30 or 60 days. The CQI assessment, this is a minimum requirement. But if you've stated in your procedures that you will complete this within 30, 60 days, the 90-day isn't a default. And when you go through an external audit and you're not meeting your own internal procedure, you're going to end up with the non-conformance. So you need to understand customer requirements along with the CQI requirement.
This may be a Jeremyism, but when it comes to internal requirements, don't sandpaper your own backside. All right?
Right. Yeah, you can set yourself up for failure.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again, team, and thanks everybody for joining us. If you're looking to learn more CQIs, pick up the standards, visit Plexus INTL, visit AIG.org, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.